Hello, friends. How are you? Hope you are doing well. Today's topic is about the climate change and the associated risk. So, let us start. What is the climate change? The climate change refers to the long term shift in the temperatures and the weather patterns. So, these shifts may be natural, but since the 1800th century, human activities have been the main driver for climate change, or we can say anthropogenic activity. So, primarily due to the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas, which produces heat trapping gases like greenhouse gases. Why is climate change a problem? So, humans and wild animals face new challenges for survival because of the climate change. More frequent and intense droughts, storms, heat waves, rising sea levels, melting glaciers, and warming oceans, and can directly harm animals, destroying the places they live, can disturb the habitats, and wreak havoc on people's livelihoods and communities. Why is climate change a threat? So climate change is already impacting health in a countless of ways, including by leading to the death and illness from increasingly frequent extreme weather events such as heat waves, storms and floods, and the disruption of the food chain or food systems, increasing in zoonosis and food, water, and vector-borne diseases and mental health issues actually. So, what are the causes and effects of the climate change? Anthropogenic activities or human made activities such as burning fossil fuels and destroying the rainforests having an increasing influence on climate and the earth's temperatures. This adds huge quantities of GHG gases, greenhouse gases, to those naturally present in the atmosphere and increasing the greenhouse gas effect and global leading to global warming. Is climate change the same as global warming? So, global warming refers to the rise in global temperatures mainly due to the increasing concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So, climate change refers to the increasing changes in the measures of climate over a long period of time, including we can say precipitation, rain, basically, temperatures, and weather patterns. What is the global warming and its causes? So, global warming is an aspect of climate change referring to the long term rise of the planet's temperatures, and it is caused by increased concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, mainly from human activities such as burning fossil fuels and farming, as an example. Why is global warming a problem? Global warming can result in many serious alterations to the environment, eventually impacting the human health. So it can also cause a rise in the sea level, leading to the loss of coastal land, a change in the precipitation patterns, increased risk of droughts and floods, and threat to the biodiversity. What is the meaning of climate risk? The climate risk refers to the risk assessment based on the formal analysis of the consequences, likelihoods, and responses to the impacts of climate change and how societal constraints shape adaptation options. So, climate risk can be because of the global warming, because of the greenhouse gases, and the climate risk assessment, which is a kind of risk assessment based on the formal analysis of the severity, means consequences, likelihoods, probabilities, and responses to the impact of the climate change. What are the main climate risks? There are two different types of risks: physical and transition risk. First, physical risk is about are either they can be acute or chronic. Acute risks include droughts, floods, extreme precipitation, and wildfires, where chronic risks include rising temperature, the expansion of tropical pests and diseases into the temperature zones, and an accelerating loss of the biodiversity as well. Then transition risk, which can arise from the transition to a low carbon economy or maybe technological changes or policy related constraints, right? So what type of risk is the climate risk exactly? So climate risk drivers can be grouped into two categories: physical risk and climate risk. Physical risk, which I told you earlier, which arise from the changes in the weather and climate that impact the economy, and transition risk, which arise from the transition to a low carbon economy. Why is climate risk so important for us? Because with the effects of the climate change becoming increasingly pronounced, disclosure of the climate risk is critical for the businesses. If we are failing into disclosures of climate related risk, which can facilitate poor investment decisions, asset losses, and the continuation of trade practices that lead to the climate change. Now, what is the climate risk screening? How we go for identification and screening of the climate related risk? Climate and disaster risk screening represents a proactive approach to consider short-term and long-term climate and disaster risk in the business and national sector planning processes as well. Climate change and disaster poses a growing threat to the development progress as well. Is this climate risk a kind of financial risk as well? Yes, risk management is an essential function for banks for good regions. But climate risk is an important source of financial risk as well. Climate risk include both the risk of unmitigated climate change and the risk to a business's bottom line posed by the climate policy as well. Why is climate risk important? As I said, with the effects of climate change becoming increasingly pronounced, and disclosure of climate risk is very critical for businesses. So as I said earlier, the failure to make these disclosures and identification and assessment of the climate risk, which can facilitate poor investment decisions, asset losses, and continuation of the trade processes that can lead to the climate change. How do you manage the risk of climate? What are the management practices? We can say regulations, research, development and deployment of new technologies, conservation of resources, efforts to increase public awareness, their capacity building and upskilling, positive incentives to encourage choices that lower emissions, and adding a price to greenhouse gas emissions, which creates incentives to reduce emissions in a broad manner actually. What is the meaning of climate risk analysis? So climate risk assessment analyzes how climate change and extreme weather events interact with socio-economic factors in order to determine the overall risk for the affected population. What is the meaning of climate risk vulnerability? This is the next learning point where we say climate change vulnerability or climate risk vulnerability, which is defined as the propensity or predisposition to be adversely affected because of the climate change. It can apply to humans but also to natural systems, or we can say ecosystems as well. A human and ecosystem vulnerability are interdependent to each other. Next is, what are the climate related risks and opportunities? As I said earlier, we divide the climate related risk into the physical impacts of the climate change like extreme weather events and rise of the sea level, and risk related to the transition to a low carbon economy like changing market demand and the carbon pricing as well. Next is, how do you evaluate the climate risk? So we follow certain principles of risk, severity, likelihood, probability, vulnerability, such certain factors we consider for this. So the natural hazard based approach to assess climate risk begins by characterizing the climate hazards and can be written as possible like risk is equal to probability of the climate hazard and vulnerability of that hazard. It generally is fixed at a given level and used to estimate changing vulnerability over space and over the time as well. What does it mean to be net zero? This is also a very important term in the climate change subject. So net zero refers to the balance between the amount of greenhouse gases which are being produced and the amount which are being removed from the atmosphere. Okay, so we reach net zero when the amount we add is not more than the amount which is being taken away. Now, what does it mean to be net zero by 2050? The meaning of this is, it is international scientific consensus that in order to prevent the worst climate damages, global net human caused emissions of CO2, carbon dioxide, need to fall by about 45% from 2010 levels by 2030 and reaching net zero around 2050 actually. How can a country reach net zero? So technically speaking, global net zero will be achieved when human caused greenhouse gas emissions have been reduced to the absolute minimum levels feasible, and any remaining residual emissions are balanced by an equivalent quantity of permanent anthropogenic removals so that they cannot be released into the atmosphere. One more term which is very important in climate change subject, which is carbon neutral. What does mean carbon neutral actually? Carbon neutrality means having a balance between emitting carbon and absorbing carbon from the atmosphere in the carbon sinks actually. So removal of the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and then storing it is known as carbon sequestration. Now next is, what is the carbon neutral with example? When carbon neutral refers to balancing out the total amount of carbon emissions, means net zero carbon, no carbon was emitted from the get-go, so no carbon needs to be captured or offset. For example, a company is building running entirely on solar and using zero fossil fuels can be labeled its energy as zero carbon. Okay, how do you become carbon neutral? So we can say the only way to truly become carbon neutral is to balance out your remaining emissions through carbon offsetting or contributing financially to the projects that decrease greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere. Is carbon neutral at the same as net zero? Net zero is similar in principle to carbon neutrality, but it is expanded in scale. So to achieve net zero means to go beyond removal of just carbon emissions. Net zero refers to all greenhouse gases being emitted into the atmosphere, such as methane, nitrous oxide, and other hydrofluorocarbons and perfluorocarbons as well. How do you transition to net zero? So, effective actions required to accelerate decarbonization, including shifting the energy mix away from the fossil fuels and towards zero emissions electricity and other low emission energy sources such as, for an example, hydrogen, adapting industrial and agricultural processes, increasing energy efficiency and managing demand for energy. Thank you very much for now, and we will discuss next discussion in the next meeting. Thank you.